In 1530, Margaret of Austria stepped on a piece of glass. At the time, it seemed like an inconvenient injury, but in truth, it was the beginning of a horrifying nightmare. From the moment she was born, Margaret of Austria was surrounded by some of Europe's most powerful players, but she had little power of her own. After years of living as a political pawn, bought and sold through marriage after marriage, she finally saw her chance to hold real power, and she took it. Through intellect and good strategy, Margaret elevated herself to a position few women had seen before her. She became the one in control. Despite her name, Margaret spent little to no time in or around Austria. Her name simply indicated that she was a member of the Austrian Habsburg family through her father, Maximilian of Austria, the future Holy Roman Emperor. Margaret was actually born in Brussels, Belgium, and considered the Netherlands her home. Together, her parents Maximilian and Mary of Burgundy ruled over the Low Countries, otherwise known as the Netherlands. Margaret never truly got to know her mother. Mary of Burgundy passed when Margaret was 2 years old. Her brother, Philip the Handsome, was just a bit older than Margaret at the time. Despite this, Philip became sovereign of the Low Countries with their father acting as regent. Margaret had her own duties to fulfill even at the age of 2. Just after her mother passed away, Margaret's father and King Louis XI of France agreed to a union between their two families. A year later, Margaret, now 3, became engaged to Louis's 13-year-old son, Charles. With the arrangement made, they shipped Margaret to France without a second thought. Little Margaret arrived in France to be the ward of King Louis XI. However, this arrangement was short-lived. Louis passed in August of the same year, making his son and Margaret's betrothed, King Charles VIII of France, at the humble age of 13. This prompted a new matter to settle. What were they to do with Charles's tiny bride-to-be? Louis XI never put much time or energy into the raising of little Margaret. Therefore, she would have likely been placed in the household of Charlotte of Savoy, the Queen Mother. Unfortunately, Charlotte died by the end of 1483. Given her young age, Margaret could be molded into the perfect future queen. The French royal family just needed to find another person to take on the responsibility of raising Margaret. Anne de Beaujeu, Charles's sister and regent, became that person. They placed Margaret within Anne's household, and a governess provided Margaret with a superior education, along with several other noble children, including her future sister-in-law, Louise of Savoy. Margaret's future should have been set in stone, but things were about to change for the little queen-to-be. Charles made a diabolical decision that turned everything on its head. Due to the politics of the time, Charles decided to disregard the arrangement to marry Margaret of Austria and married Anne, Duchess of Brittany, instead, Margaret's own stepmother. The chain of events that led to Margaret being rejected and Anne, Duchess of Brittany, becoming queen instead are complicated. Anne married Margaret's father Maximilian by proxy in December 1490, thus making her Margaret's stepmother. What should have been an innocent exchange of vows quickly unraveled. For Charles, Anne marrying Maximilian was a direct attack upon France. Therefore, he stormed into Rennes, where Anne was, and demanded to revoke her marriage to Maximilian and marry him instead. Anne agreed, and by doing so, completely changed the trajectory of Margaret's future. The marriage between Anne and Charles occurred in the fall of 1491. As a result, the French court immediately stopped treating Margaret as their future queen. She had arrived in France at the age of 2. It was the only home she had ever really known. Once Charles and Maximilian signed the Treaty of Senlis, Margaret went home. However, her time in France left a lasting impression on her. She'd cared deeply for Charles, and then she was thrown away because another woman served his purposes better. This felt like a terrible betrayal. Margaret never forgot or forgave. She harbored a grudge towards Charles's family, the House of Valois. Following the end of her arrangement with Charles, Margaret returned to the Netherlands for the first time since she was 2. However, Margaret did not remain in the Netherlands for long. Her father, Maximilian, intended to forge an alliance with Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, the Queen and King of Spain. He arranged for Margaret to go to Spain and marry John, Prince of Asturias, while John's sister, Joanna of Castile, came to the Netherlands to marry Margaret's elder brother, Philip. Now that she was 16, Margaret could illegally marry John by proxy in Belgium, which meant he couldn't cast her aside the way Charles had. But just as things seemed to settle, disaster struck. Her ship ran into a storm in the Bay of Biscay, and Margaret began to fear she might never make it to Spain and to her future husband, John. Believing the storm might mark her end, Margaret prepared herself for death. She even wrote her own epitaph, which showed both wit and a keen awareness of her life so far. Here lies Margaret, the willing bride, twice married, but a virgin when she died. Though death seemed to circle her like a hawk, Margaret eventually reached Spain and prepared to be married. At last, Margaret arrived in Spain and married John on April 3, 1497, but her good fortune didn't last long. John died just 6 months later, on October 4, 1497, from a fever, leaving Margaret stranded once again in a foreign country that had welcomed her as its future queen and now didn't know what to do with her again. This time, though, Margaret had something of John's to hold on to. She was pregnant with his child, at least for a while. Tragedy continued to haunt her. In April 1498, Margaret went into labor prematurely and gave birth to a stillborn daughter. Now no longer a wife or a mother, Margaret became a companion and tutor to her young sister-in-law, Catherine of Aragon. Margaret stayed on long enough to teach Catherine French before finally returning home in September 1499. Neither Spain or France had any place for her anymore, but at last her brother found one. His wife Joanna had just given birth to a son, and Philip wrote to Margaret begging her to come home and become the child's godmother. With 2 failed marriages, it seemed that being a godmother and aunt may have been all Margaret was good for, until another opportunity arose. Margaret's destiny included one more marriage. After all, by 1501, despite her tumultuous life, Margaret was only 21 years old, the same age as her second husband and third fiancé, Philibert II, Duke of Savoy. Luckily, this time, Margaret finally seemed to get it right. Both Philibert and Margaret had been married twice already, Philibert's first wife being 7 years younger than he was. They appeared to reach this union as equals, perhaps relieved to finally have a spouse of a similar age, and their marriage was stable. More than stable this time, Margaret found a spouse she truly cared for. Savoy had a crisis of leadership when Margaret arrived. René, Philibert's illegitimate half-brother, controlled the government. Margaret used all of her resources, including the substantial clout provided by her father, the Holy Roman Emperor, overlord of Savoy, to remove any legitimacy René had. Margaret couldn't have been more successful. She succeeded in naming René a traitor, forcing him to flee Savoy and seek refuge with an old acquaintance of Margaret's, her old schoolmate and sister-in-law Louise of Savoy. With René out of the way, Margaret stepped in and took control of the government. She'd finally found a place and a man to suit her. However, tragedy still hovered around her like a cloud. Margaret spent 3 years with Philibert before he also passed away. In response to Philibert's death, Margaret did something utterly heartbreaking. she hurled herself out of a window. Fortunately, she survived. While Margaret managed to carry on after Philibert's loss, she never forgot him. In fact, she went to peculiar, even disturbing by modern standards, lengths to keep his memory alive. Members of the court persuaded her to bury him, but Margaret kept part of Philibert with her always. She embalmed his heart to preserve it and carry him with her. Named Lady of Mourning by the court historian, Margaret embodied her loss, and unlike in the past, she was in no rush to return home. Margaret remained in Savoy for 2 years during this time. As Philibert's widow, her primary project was the construction of the royal monastery of Brou, designed to house Philibert's remains as well as his mother's, and when the time came, Margaret's own. The evidence made it clear that Margaret had no intention of leaving Philibert or his home. However, her father and brother had other plans. Briefly, in 1505, Margaret's brother and father attempted to hatch another plan for Margaret's future. Despite being once jilted and twice widowed, Margaret was only 25. Maximilian and Philip tried to arrange yet another marriage for Margaret, this time to the reigning King of England, 48-year-old Henry VII. Although Margaret refused to marry Henry VII, the two men in her life sent her portrait to England anyways. The portrait was likely 5 years old, and with Margaret's refusal to participate, little came from the arrangement. Henry, whose first wife had passed 2 years earlier, never remarried. Margaret was planning on spending the rest of her life in Savoy, but once again, fate had other plans for her. In 1504, Queen Isabella of Portugal died. Margaret's first husband, John, Isabella's younger brother, had already passed away, and Isabella's son had died with him. That left the crown to Joanna and Margaret's brother, Philip. But tragedy struck again. Philip died suddenly just a year later. This created a major problem for the family. Philip's son Charles was only 6 years old, and Joanna was considered too unstable to rule as his regent. Margaret's father couldn't intervene. As the ruler of the Low Countries, he had to remain physically in the region. As Holy Roman Emperor, Maximilian was occupied elsewhere. He needed his daughter. At her father's request, Margaret returned to the Netherlands after Philip's death. For the first time, Margaret stepped into her own power. She no longer needed a husband to prove her own worth. With no other suitable regent, Maximilian appointed Margaret as governor of the Low Countries and guardian of her brother's children, including Charles. Only Philip's second son, Ferdinand, stayed in Spain under the care of Joanna's father, Ferdinand II of Aragon. After years of being used for political gain, Margaret finally held real power, but it came with challenges. Chosen by the Representative Assembly, Margaret's position became official in 1509. She remains the only woman ever elected to rule the Low Countries. Still, some believed her chaotic past created cause for concern. Although born in Brussels, how much time had Margaret truly spent in the Netherlands? Some claimed her childhood in France made people view her as a foreigner, but other historians disagree, arguing that Margaret, Philip, and Charles were all seen as native to the Netherlands. Whatever the opinion, Margaret ruled with confidence and strength, setting the stage for future female leaders. In 1520, Charles named Margaret his governor-general in recognition of her service. She became the only regent he reappointed without limit. Some believe this reflects her role as a political equivalent of queen consort. Margaret led the Netherlands calmly and with wisdom, guiding the Low Countries through years of hardship and unrest. She navigated many conflicts during her time as regent and governor of the Low Countries. This turmoil started early during her time as regent, with conflict arising over relationships with France. France expected Charles to pay homage to their king. This feud would have gotten out of control if not for Margaret's calm and controlled thinking. Margaret convinced Maximilian to finish the conflict with King Louis XII. She traveled to Cambrai to contribute to the creation of the League of Cambrai. Through this, Margaret succeeded in providing a new target for the French, northern Italy. By doing this, she expertly dodged the threat of an invasion. Unfortunately, more nations had their eyes on the Netherlands. The Duchy of Guelders within the region of the Low Countries had long been a problem for the ruling family. Both Maximilian and Philip fought them previously, and now Margaret was left to deal with the threat of another uprising. Although Margaret handled the feud with Guelders in the end, she saw no need to continue to waste her resources on conflicts. She set about changing that. By 1512, Margaret was done fighting with anyone who felt they could take on the Netherlands. On the basis that the Netherlands operated through trade and peace, Margaret asserted that the nation was neutral. However, she continued using foreign armies and capital to wage conflict. The Netherlands just kept their names off of it. This strategy of peace and negotiation proved extremely successful. Margaret was an instrumental force for many reasons. She helped unite the Holy League, her father Maximilian, the Swiss, the Pope, Ferdinand II of Aragon, and Henry VIII. But that wasn't all. She also played a crucial role in ensuring that Charles, and not his younger brother, succeeded Maximilian as Holy Roman Emperor. When Maximilian passed in 1519, there was opposition to 18-year-old Charles taking over. Some favored his younger brother, Archduke Ferdinand, instead. France pushed for their own candidate. Margaret skillfully navigated the election, using diplomacy and a bit of bribery to secure her ward's success. Having long influenced his upbringing and reign, Margaret continued to shape Charles's rule as Holy Roman Emperor. Because of the feuds Charles inherited and the many kingdoms within the empire, the Netherlands faced invasion once again. Yet Margaret proved she had earned her role as the governor of the Low Countries. She used her diplomacy to negotiate peace, with some help from an old friend. Since Margaret left, France had seen many changes. Francis I now ruled as king, and his mother wielded significant power. She acted as regent early in his reign and at other critical moments. Margaret knew Francis's mother well. It was Louise of Savoy. Margaret and Louise had once shared a classroom and now met again as equals, two women who found power through their children. Together they negotiated peace between their nations. At the peak of her power, it seemed nothing could go wrong, but fate had one more cruel twist waiting for her. By 1530, Margaret was 50 and living her best life. She had respect, power, and comfort. After a terribly turbulent childhood, everything finally settled, and Margaret was safe and likely content. On November 15, 1530, one tiny mistake sealed Margaret's fate. She stepped on a piece of glass. The injury was inconvenient, but not life-threatening. In fact, Margaret gave it little thought. Perhaps that's why the cut became infected. Gangrene set in, and Margaret faced the harsh truth. She needed to have her leg amputated. A level-headed woman to the end, Margaret settled her affairs before surgery. She named Charles V her sole heir and wrote to him, urging him to maintain peace with France and England. Once settled, doctors arrived on November 30th to perform the operation. But that's where everything went wrong. The doctors gave her opium for pain relief, but tragically the dose was too strong. The result? Margaret of Austria never woke up. She was laid to rest in the tomb she had built in Savoy, finally reunited with her late husband Philibert. Margaret's legacy lived on when Charles appointed her sister Mary of Hungary as governor. In a time when women were often pawns in power struggles, Margaret paved the way for women to take control and seize power themselves. Thanks for watching History Exposé. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page FactNate for more incredible facts about everything.